morning, everyone. Thank you. Thanks, John. My name is Nicole Richter. I'm the Training and Compliance Specialist here at Medina County Board of DD, so welcome. Today we have Jim Bennett with us from DODD, who's going to be presenting on Ohio ISP planning and implementation. We have folks joining us virtually today, as well as in person for those that are joining virtually and can't see everyone. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. If we have questions today, feel free to ask during the presentation. Just let me run over to you with a microphone so the folks online can hear what you're asking. Restrooms are along the wall outside the door here. We are recording today's presentation, so it will be available to watch on our YouTube page within a few days. Other than that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim.
Thanks, Nicole. Thank you, everyone. As Nicole mentioned, I'm Jim Bennett. I work for the Department of Developmental Disabilities, DODD. My role is as a regional support facilitator, which is like a totally made-up role saying that basically I work for the OhioISP team. So I do a lot of work with the OhioISP, as I'm sure you guys have heard a lot about, especially in the last year. I know you guys have been doing a lot of hard work here in Medina County. Always good to be out here. I've been here a few times presenting. Appreciate Sabrina and Ed and Nicole and Zach for setting this all up. So Nicole mentioned questions here. I know there's several people joining virtually, so I'll try to look both ways or like trying to turn back and forth. Virtually, if you guys have questions as well, pop those in the chat. I think Zach and Nicole are going to try to keep me apprised of those questions as they come in, and we'll try to address them as we go, just so we're kind of staying consistent with the topic. So got a lot of good information today. When Sabrina and I talked, well, it was probably about a month ago, about kind of doing something with providers and SSAs here, started putting some things together. So really, this is kind of tailored to, a lot of what we feel are the need areas in this county. I always try to speak to what you guys need and what you want to hear, and answer questions that you may have. So hopefully you find this beneficial. Just one quick thing about me, though, too. I mentioned I'm part of the OhioISP team, but for those of you who have heard me before, I used to work in compliance, so I did compliance reviews. So I did accreditation, provider compliance. So I have that background, as well as I worked in the DCs doing some behavior support. So always like to say that just so you kind of know a little bit of my background, and kind of extends beyond just the OhioISP. All right. Oh, can you go to the next slide, Zach? I'm moving on my screen, and I'm like, why is it not showing up? Okay. So a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. And Zach, you guys can hear me okay? All right. This is a little bit of the agenda for today. We're just going to talk a little bit about the team process. I'm sure you guys have heard a lot of this information before, but it's always good to reinforce, what is expected as far as team process and the roles for each of those parties. We're going to specifically focus on SSA and provider roles and expectations. And then we're going to get into the OhioISP planning process and talk a little bit about that, specifically getting into some of those ISP sections, risks, outcomes, service supports. Those are kind of the primary sections within the ISP. Restrictive measures would be the other one that would fall in that category. But as we know, that's not something that's part of every plan. So if there are questions, we could obviously address them, but this is going to be our primary focus today. And then after planning, we get into implementation. So we know planning's a big part of this, right? And it's part of everyone's role, not just the SSAs, but after we get in planning, equally important is the implementation piece and making sure we're doing what we need to there as well. So we will talk about all of that. want you all to participate. I want you all to ask questions. That's what we're here for. I don't expect you all to be experts at the end of today, but this is a process. We're always evolving as a field, which is, I guess good and bad, right? We always talk about how things are changing within the field and how the state's always kind of changing things, but really it's an evolution. We're trying to kind of keep pushing forward, and so I think that's a good thing to make sure we're kind of evolving with the mindset and with our culture. All right, so team process. This is just a slide showing teamwork, right? I feel like this is part of every presentation. Like there's this thing with like the hands in, or like everyone with their hands up in the middle. So team process. Zach, if you could go to the next slide. This is really the process that teams are going to follow. And this is part of kind of everyone's role in this. And I'm sure you've seen this cycle before, adapted a little bit to include providers as well, but kind of shows the steps of the process that we want you guys to follow. So we start at the top with assessment. Assessment is the first step. It's really, I don't want to say it's the most important, but I think it's often overlooked or undervalued. The assessment process is where teams are getting to know the person. You're getting to know what that person's wants and their likes are, what their needs are, and we're really trying to answer all of these different questions. If you've looked at the OhioISP, this is the bulk of the OhioISP. There are a lot of questions. When the external work group developed the OhioISP, and the external work group was developed from people of all different parts of the field. We had provider representation, we had county board representation, there were ICF people, there were parents, guardians, there were people who receive services. So try to get a good representation of everyone. But that assessment section has a lot of questions in it. It's really geared to get to know the person as best we can. And that should really start with the person. We want those questions to be asked of the person served when possible. And if the person can't answer some of those questions, then we go to the people that know that person best. And a lot of times, that's the providers in the crowd, that's you all. Going to the providers who provide the services, going to the DSPs who are working with that person directly. And that's not always easy because your time's limited. You're providing services. I knew I was going to do that at some point here. I'm trying to keep this charged. It's not always easy, but we have to find good ways to accomplish that. Finding ways, whether it be through the monitoring process, where SSAs are going to check in on the people served. That assessment process, I think historically we've looked at that as asking questions around a table of professionals, right? Like, well, what do you want to do with your life? And asking all of these different questions. What's the best thing that's happened to you? What's your good day look like for you? What's a bad day look like for you? All of those questions historically, I think we've looked at those as part of that meeting process where we've got all these professionals sitting around a table. And we really want you to look at that assessment process differently. We want you to get into the mindset of this doesn't happen around a table. The assessment process should be something that happens on an ongoing basis, and it may not just occur in one setting or sitting. It could be over time. It could be multiple sessions where you're sitting with this person and you're talking to this person in settings that are comfortable for them. Making sure that you're getting really good information from that person. So this is really where we want to start. We want to get that good information because the assessment's going to drive the planning process. And this is the bulk of what we're going to talk about today is the planning process. Ensuring that we're getting to know what that person wants and needs, and then from there, that's going to establish how we plan for services. So the services then are going to meet that person's wants and needs. So it should kind of flow in a way that makes sense for that particular person. And obviously it's going to look different for each person. I think the key here, though, is we want providers to be part of this discussion. This doesn't happen in a vacuum. The assessment process, the planning process, this should really all be collaborative in nature. As we get into the planning, we're starting to put things into service categories, right? Like we're authorizing services based on that assessment, based on the services that person wants and needs. And so the planning process, the providers should really understand what is being written into that plan, so they know what the expectations are, they know what they're expected to provide. And providers, you're agreeing when you sign that plan, you're agreeing to the services that are written into that plan. So moving on to the monitoring process. And I have implementation slash monitoring. So the implementation is more of the providers, implementing the plan, and the monitoring is more of the SSAs, kind of keeping an ongoing watch as to how things are going. And both are an important part of this process. So staff are trained on the ISP portion, right? So when you kind of get the plan developed and the plan is finalized, we have to start implementing it. So the first step for providers, you're training your staff on the ISP. So we've got a lot of questions about, like, the OhioISP is this big, it's this big document. It's one plan, but there's 3 sections of it. Okay, there's the assessment, and then there's the ISP, and there's an introduction page, which is like this 1-page, maybe 2-page summary. It's like a profile, or we could call it different things, but it's basically like a 1-page summary. And I know a lot of providers, we used to do it at the DCs, where you would just generate a summary for your staff, right? Like, this is the most important things to know, and that's really what that introduction page is meant to be. So kind of got off on a little bit of a tangent there, but providers going to be training on the ISP portion. We're all going to be checking in with that person and checking in as a team, and that's why this ongoing conversation is at the center of it all, because throughout this, we're going to be working together as a team to try to collaborate, to try to ensure that everything is working the way it should be. So, that monitoring process for SSAs, what's working, what's not working. I've seen so many times where it's not until the annual meeting where you find out, oh, well, this person doesn't want to do this outcome. They've been refusing. It's like, oh, well, where did we go wrong? Where did we miss the boat? Because we should have been having those conversations all along. It's not just about the annual event. It's about an ongoing process to ensure that person's living a good life, right? We all want that person to do things that they want to do. We all want them to live a good, meaningful life. So we should be talking throughout. So, and we can't really place blame in those situations, because if it's a year gone by and that person they've been refusing to do things that are part of their outcome, or been refusing services. I saw this a lot with, as part of the HCBS team, and we did a lot with community integration. Like people, maybe not wanting to go out into the community, and that's okay. They can choose to do that, but it's like, well, this is a service that's built into the plan, so if they're not choosing to do this, are we having those conversations? Is it what we're doing out in the community that they don't want to do? Is there something that we need to change? So we should always be having those conversations to ensure that we get to the point where we're doing things that are meaningful to the person. So having those conversations, ensuring that we are changing things as things in that person's life change. Okay. And then the last part here is the revision process. Again, this is sort of a product of that monitoring piece. So SSAs, checking in, making sure we know what's working, what's not working. If something's not working, then we may need to go back to the drawing board. Okay, so say we had an outcome that was about the person wanting to go out in the community more again. And that person no longer wants to do that. They've changed their mind, which people do, right? We change our minds. So now we got to say, all right, well, what does that person want to do? And that's where that revision process comes into play. So we're making those revisions as things in that person's life change. Okay, it's an ongoing, fluid document. It should be a living, breathing document that we are going to be following, not just changing once a year. Okay. Do we have any questions? Zach, anything you see? Okay. Any questions here so far? All right. So if we go to the next slide. Oh, I didn't realize it was going to like gradually appear. So team process. We talked about this kind of being the first step of what we're going to be talking about today. Looks different for everyone, as it should, right? Team process isn't going to be the same for everyone because everyone's different. Everyone has different wants and needs. We're going to use creative ways to get this information, right? Just like today. I was talking to the folks sitting here. How usually when I come here, this place is full. So I don't know. You guys maybe have heard me too much. I'm thinking like, I don't know. Like maybe they just don't got it the way I used to. But we've got new ways to get information to people. We've got technology. So we're doing this as a hybrid model today. We could use the same creative ways to get information for our folks using virtual calls or technology in some ways to get that information. Everyone's time is valuable. You guys all have a lot to do and not a lot of time to do it. So finding creative, efficient ways to get that information to people, and including everyone. All team members have a valuable role. And if there's one thing about the OhioISP, it really, when we designed the OhioISP, it was meant to ensure that everyone's voice is being heard. Okay, all of those team members who are part of a person's team, all of those team members should have a voice and they should be heard in some capacity. The team's role is to ensure that what the person's, this is weird, a little strangely, but what the person wants happens. So if the person wants this, we're going to try our darndest to get that done. And we're going to try to find ways, the best ways to get that to happen. Now, that's not to say that everything that the person wants does happen, right? But we're going to try to find how we can best get those things done. And then team process is continuous. This is an ongoing thing. We're always going to kind of keep working to ensure that, again, we're evolving because these are people that we're dealing with. It's not just, okay, this is it, and then everything stays the same from here on out. We're always kind of working to make sure that that communication's happening. Okay. Next slide, please. So here's where we get into the team member roles. I talked about focusing on two in particular, which would be SSAs and providers, since that's who's here today. For the SSAs, you guys are the ones who are writing the plans. And notice I don't, at one point we were saying SSAs are the plan authors. And got a little pushback from the self-advocates out there because they say, well, we're the ones who are actually authoring our plan, and there's a lot of validity to that. It's really the person's plan. SSAs, you're kind of pulling all that information in, and you guys are writing the plan. So you guys are kind of organizing. We use the, what is it, point of contact or central point of coordination. Lots of different terms over the years, but you guys are the ones who are organizing and driving all of this communication, kind of pulling all that information together. We use this dig deeper phrase a lot, kind of helping to dig deeper and figure out ways, get to know the person better. We talk about this a lot in our, we do some monthly gatherings with SSAs and QIDPs, and we talk about, how important it is to develop that relationship with the person, just like any other relationship in our lives. The more you get to know the person, the better the rapport you have, the more you're going to learn. And I'm sure you guys have people that you work with that you've known for several years, and the more you talk to them, the more you get to know them, the more you learn about them. I mean, there's times where I've worked with some of my colleagues for 10, 15 years, and I learn something new about them every day. What they like, what they've done. So that digging deeper it's not to say that we have to press people and we have to dig into their livelihood. It's to develop that relationship with them, find out what it is that they want and need in their life, and then figure out ways to make it happen. Okay, again, talked about ensuring that all team members' voices are heard. It doesn't mean that we're going to take everything that's said and apply it, right? Because there's times where, we have to kind of massage everything into the way it needs to be. But we want to make sure people feel heard. So again, just like with everything else, we have to make sure that we are being respectful of all of those team members. Talked about authoring the plan, and I think maybe even more important is ensuring people know what is expected. So, talking to providers here today. Oh, skipping ahead. Talking to providers here today, it's really about kind of ensuring they know what is written into the plan and they know how to accomplish that. Because if we're writing a plan and the people that are implementing it don't know what to do, then that's a problem. Okay. I think the last thing on there was monitors. Yeah, monitor and revise as needed. And again, we talked about that, so it's all good. All right, you could skip back ahead, Zach. Okay, so provider role. This top one talks about ensuring the right people are part of the team and sharing input. This is really about the DSP here, if we're being honest. A lot of times the administrator or some supervisor of the provider agency is part of those meetings, part of those annual meetings, and they're sharing information. And that's not to say that that can't happen, because I know oftentimes it's the only way it can happen, right? That's just part of how that system operates and part of the structure of that team. However, the DSP needs to have that voice, and so we need to ensure that that DSP's voice is heard. One of the best things, and when I worked at the DCs, this was 10, 15 years ago, and there's certainly things that back then we would do a lot differently now, but one of the things that we did back then that I loved was there was a DSP that was part of those meetings so that they could share what they knew. So if that DSP, if they're not part of that meeting, that's okay, because we talked about this being an ongoing process. It's less about that one-time event. It's not about that annual meeting. It's an ongoing process. So that DSP's voice needs to be heard in some capacity throughout that process. So if they're not able to be part of that annual meeting or some of those special team meetings that happen along the way, that's okay. But how are we getting input from them? Is there, I know some counties have done like sheets where the DSP can fill them out. Is the SSA going to do their monitoring and talking to the DSP while they're providing services? That seems like an efficient way to do things, right? Like DSP can continue to do what they're doing, but also providing some feedback. Finding the best way to get that information from the direct support professionals. Building good relationships with the person, obviously. We want to make sure we're developing those relationships and allowing them to be advocates. We also want to implement, right? We talked about the provider's job is to implement the plan. So helping that person do what they want to do and checking in to discuss the progress. I guess the big thing here would be if there are things that you're doing for that person, sharing that information with the SSA so that, again, like we want that plan to reflect what's happening and we want that implementation to be done consistently. So all of that important information should be in the plan because we got DSPs, right? Like it's hard to find DSPs, providers, right? Hard to find DSPs, and so if we got turnover, people don't know the person well. We want to be doing things consistently so that we can ensure that everyone is working together to implement this plan the way that everyone has agreed to. Providers, if something's not working, reaching out to the SSA, contacting them, giving your feedback so we can have a discussion about that. And maybe that leads to a revision, maybe it doesn't, but we've got to have that communication. And then documenting what is needed in the plan. And we're going to get a little bit more into the documentation piece later, but documentation is obviously a key part of compliance. It's something you need to do. And then it helps with determining where we go with that planning process moving forward, with some of those revisions, ensuring that we are right on track with what needs to be done. Okay. So any questions on roles, expectations, team process? Okay. All right, planning. So we're kind of transitioning into the planning part of the agenda here. I like this. This is something that we have on our website, on our OhioISP website. So for those of you guys who have not been to our OhioISP website, I think it's on a later slide. I have the address, but this is part of one of our resources that's on there, and it talks a little bit about what planning is and what planning isn't, and I think it does a really good job of kind of walking through really what we're looking for as part of person-centered process. So what it is, it's an ongoing conversation, an ongoing process. Talked about changing when life changes. What it isn't, a one-time annual event. Okay. Document doesn't change. It's very static. So we have to be willing to change things when it's needed. I know a lot of, I don't want to say a lot, but some counties have gotten away from that one-time annual meeting, which is fine. Okay, it's really up to whoever is making those decisions. But obviously there are annual requirements as part of that are built into that annual meeting. But really, from a rules standpoint, as long as you're updating things as they go along, that's really the most important part of that. Focuses on skills, abilities, and needs as opposed to deficits only. I think a lot of the counties, especially up in this region, you guys do a really, really good job of kind of staying skill-based, focusing on those strengths. The OhioISP is really built in that manner. We're calling out skills and abilities. So I think that's one that we hit the mark on pretty consistently. Full team involvement with the person at the center, as opposed to either the SSA or even a provider developing the plan on their own. Okay, so we want that good collaboration. We want teams to work together to develop that plan. creatively addressing those support needs, so using technology, using those resources that are available, as opposed to just doing it through paid services. So Britta Huff, who's our community life engagement person in this area, she does a really good job of, she does a lot with community integration and tech, and talks a lot about how, like, sometimes paid services get in the way of, they serve as like a barrier of getting into access of other resources in the community. And we don't want that to happen. We want that to serve as a bridge. And we want it to be a part of it, but we also know that people who receive services, there's other opportunities out there for them. So we want to take advantage of those. We want it to be authorization of supports and services based on needs identified in the assessment, as opposed to what is available or what has previously been provided. So this is sort of like going back to that cycle that we showed earlier, assessing the need, and then we plan based on the need, right? Or what the wants are, needs and wants. And we are going to then authorize services based on that. That hasn't always happened. We'll always just say, like, well, this person gets vocab services, so here's what we're going to provide as far as services that fall within that service. We don't want to do it that way. We want to see what those wants and needs are, and then authorize services based on that. It's a living, and this is probably the most important of all of these, living document to ensure people can live a life that is meaningful to them. I think we all agree, like, no matter what your stance is on person-centered planning or how things should be done, I think we all want people to live meaningful lives. I think we can all agree on that. So how do we get them to live meaningful lives? How do we get them to live their best life? That's what we're all trying to do. I feel like that's what we all want to work toward. That's the end goal, as opposed to just a document, right? Like, we obviously need the plan. We need it for, it's a Medicaid requirement. We need a plan. We need to ensure that people understand what is part of the plan and what we're doing. But we don't want to just focus on compliance. We don't want to just focus on being sure that, well, this is in the plan. We want to get to this point. So I know a lot of our compliance people will talk about, if you guys are doing things to help that person live to a meaningful life, a lot of times everything just kind of falls into place. So compliance is important, yes, but are we reaching this goal? Are we trying to get there? Because I've seen a lot of people who are, compliant in a lot of ways, but some of that meaningfulness gets lost along the way, and even vice versa to some extent. And then lastly, we want it to be an easy to read and understand document. If you're reading the document, it shouldn't be full of jargon, shouldn't be, we're not trying to fill it with big words that people don't understand. We want it to be simple and easy to read, and avoiding those acronyms, some of that jargon that we often use. If the person or the DSPs don't understand it, then I think we're kind of missing the mark here. Okay. So again, this is part of one of our resources on our OhioISP website, which I'll share in a bit. Zach, if you could switch that forward. Okay, risks. She's taking a risk walking across those mountains or whatever she's doing there. I don't know if there's a tightrope or what. Okay. So what, Zach, I'm sorry, if you could just go back to that. So we're going to talk a little bit about risks here. What constitutes a risk in your eyes? Any thoughts as to what would qualify as a risk for someone? Start calling on people. Yeah. 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 So it's it's the likelihood that it will happen. Nicole, did you have something? I saw you. Okay. I mean to call you out there. Anyone else? Anyone else have any thoughts? Anyone online have any thoughts? Okay. Yeah, we get this question a lot because as we get into the planning section, we do have to identify risks for that person. And a lot of times people get confused. It's like, well, what has happened versus what could happen. But I think the point about the likelihood of it happening is a really good one to call out, because we hate to say it, but we could all go out and we could all trip and fall. Doesn't mean we're a fall risk, right? Just it could happen. Doesn't mean we're a fall risk. Same thing with choking, right? We all could be eating, and unfortunately there's always the possibility that we could choke on food. Doesn't mean we're a choking risk. So I think it's sort of a balance of taking what has happened in the past. Do we have incidents of different things occurring in the past, and the likelihood that it would happen again. So kind of taking that all in. We define it in the OhioISP, and I'm just going to read from my notes here. Any communication needs, medical needs, or behaviors that create a risk for the person in terms of immediate health and safety, risk of harm to self or others, or potential legal sanction that would need to be addressed in the person's plan, and that's based on assessed need. So again, getting back to if we're looking at assessed need, we see in the assessment that there are different things that might be risks for the person, then we're going to address them in the plan. Okay. So for folks who receive services, this could be behavioral, as mentioned, things that present risk of harm or likelihood of legal sanction. So that's from a behavior support standpoint, that's why we would have a restrictive measure. So it could be things like physical aggression or self-injurious behavior that would present a risk, and that could involve some of those restrictive measures that need to be in place. But it could also be things that are health related. So we talked about choking or falls risk. We've also seen people with disabilities who might be at risk for misappropriation or exploitation. Okay, so we have to think about all of those different things from a risk standpoint when we're doing our planning. So that's a little bit about risks. We go to the next slide, and we're going to talk about, so this is just kind of like an introduction of the risks, and then we're going to go into services and supports and outcomes. We're going to talk about all these parts and pieces of planning. And then we're going to talk about the implementation of it and how we kind of mold all that together. One other thing about risk, I always like to include this slide wherever I can. It talks about dignity of risk. And if you guys have not heard about dignity of risk is it's respect for individuals' rights to make their own decisions. Okay? Because we all make our own decisions. A lot of us have made bad decisions in the past, right? We don't always make the right decisions. So there are times where we just have to allow people to make their own mistakes and learn from them. And it's whether or not you have a disability. There are times where this has to be the case. So everyone should experience that dignity of risk with the understanding that nobody makes choices that everyone's going to agree with all the time. So we kind of have to take the judgment out of it. I think historically as a field, we've tried to protect people, and we obviously still want to protect people, right? We want to make sure that we are maintaining health and safety, and that we are doing what is necessary to ensure that people aren't out there being taken advantage of. However, we're going to support them to make the decisions the best they can, okay, to be the best person they can be. and allow them to live their best life with consideration of what's important to and for the person. So sometimes there's things that are important to the person, things that they want that don't always align with what's important for them. And so this could be a little bit of a balancing act, but I think for the most part we want to allow people to live their lives in a lot of ways. And then if we see that it's creating risk, then we address those risks as we see them. Okay. Next slide, please, Zach. Any questions about risks before we move to outcomes? All right, so outcomes, everyone knows what outcomes are, right? We've talked about it incessantly for the last, feels like 100 years, but outcomes, the entire team should understand what the person wants to accomplish and what supports they need to get there. Okay, so when we say element 5 here, this is coming from our a document that's called 6 Essential Elements of Person-Centered Planning. Clear outcomes and experiences is part of that. Those 6 essential elements. So it's element 5, and that's why that's up there. But really, an outcome is essentially what the person wants and will accomplish. So we're going to do our best to ensure that they meet this outcome. Length of time it takes to accomplish might vary, but we want to ensure we're making progress. Well, one thing with this one is we get questions a lot where it's like, well, this person wants to do this, and it's way out in the future. You can set some short-term goals, too, for folks to help lead to that. And there may be times where you get something that might be unrealistic, or in your eyes it might feel unrealistic. I think we get some of these outlying examples like, well, this person wants to be an astronaut. Okay. Well, let's lean into their love of space, what seems like a love of space, or outer space, or the galaxy, or whatever you want to call it. And let's find ways to help them to do things that align with that particular desire, right? Like, if they want to do that, then they obviously they enjoy space, they enjoy learning about outer space. So what can we do to help them to experience some of those things? Well, heck, there's a lot of, we talked about technology earlier. I'm sure there's videos, YouTube videos about space exploration, probably some that make you feel like you're there. These like simulations or whatnot. So there's probably things like that we could do to help them learn about space. There may be books that the person can read, or if they can't, that could be read to them. I'm sure is there a planetarium out here in Medina County? No? Where's the closest planetarium? Cleveland? Okay. All right. I know there's one in the Youngstown area. So, planetariums, it's like you're actually there. You're sitting in these stadium seats, and you get this little star show going on around you. Bottom line is there's ways to kind of lean into that, what a person wants to do with their life. Same thing could be said for getting their driver's license. We've heard people express that before, and there are people who have and will continue to go and get their driver's license. Okay, they have a disability, it's not going to stop them. There may be some that want their driver's license where that's never going to happen. Okay, but again, how do we lean into that desire, and are there short-term goals that we can set to ensure that they may get there? If you want your driver's license, well, again, simulations, there's lots of video games out there, there's go-karts, there's different things that we can do to get that person maybe that experience that they are looking for without actually maybe going to the next step. So those are all experiences. The things that I was talking about there, those services that the staff are going to be doing to help them get to that goal, because the outcome really should be something that's important to the person. I always shudder when I see outcomes that say the person wants to make their bed. No, they don't. Nobody does, right? Nobody does. But it's something that lands as an outcome because someone else wants them to do something. Okay? The person wants to live on their own someday. They want to go live in their own apartment. How are we going to help them to accomplish that? So those are the experiences that help that person get there. And this really drives, so the outcome drives the services. So the experiences then are good ways to help that person accomplish that outcome. And really, when you have an outcome that's important to the person, if that's meaningful to them, then those experiences, what the providers are doing, what those DSPs are doing, are helping that person to get there. And that's where you get that buy-in. That's where you could see the person really, truly responding to services. Because then those services are being done. It's like, okay, well, this is helping me get to my goal. So, staff could always just remind, well, hey, like, this is what you want to do, so, we're working toward that. Same thing with, like, an outcome for weight loss. We see this a lot of time, like weight loss or exercise. Okay, if that person really, if that's important to the person, sure, then those experiences are going to help them get there. But then if they're not, like, receptive to it, they're not, okay, well, how much buy-in is there then? Do you really want to accomplish this goal? Okay. So next slide, please, Zach. This, I kind of jumped ahead a little bit, but this slide just kind of talks about what outcomes are. Again, assessment drives the planning, so those questions that you're gonna see in that assessment section of the OhioISP, some of those are focused specifically on what that person wants. So you'll see some questions in there that really align with getting to what those outcomes are going to be. So I think there's a question in there that explicitly asks, like, what is it that you want to do with your life, in so many words, or questions that kind of get you to that end goal, which is things like, what makes a good day for you, or what makes a bad day. Some of those real person-centered, charting the life course type of questions. So that discovery phase is going to really get to those important 2s and 4s, and that's going to help lead to potentially some good outcomes here. So we're going to look through the OhioISP, through those assessment sections. We're going to try to identify themes of those important 2s. So we see a lot related to that person wanting to be independent, or maybe it's wanting to connect more with their family. Well, then our outcome is going to sort of go in that direction. We want to make sure that we're trying to align that with those important 2 themes that we see throughout. And it's really not just important 2s. It's important 2s that are not occurring for that person. So remember, an outcome is a goal. It's not something that's already happening. So sometimes we'll see person wants to, they want to connect with their family, okay, which is fine. Like, you want to talk to your family on the phone on a monthly basis. Okay, so like your family, hopefully most people do, or at least specific members of your family that you want to connect with on a regular basis. So you want to call them monthly. That's already happening. It's not really an outcome, right? Like, it's service. Like, we could help them connect to their family on a monthly basis, but that's not really, like, it's already being done. Same thing, like, we see sometimes too, like, maybe a better example would be to attend day program. Well, that's a service. It's not an outcome, okay? What is it about like, what are we doing at day program that the person wants? Like, so trying to really identify what's important to the person, and the why too. Like, okay, you see a lot of person wants to get out in the community more. Want to get out in the community. Okay, great. I want to go explore, but why? Like, why? What is the why behind it? Do they want to meet new people? Do they want to make friends? Do they want to have a significant other that they're trying to meet? Are they trying to just explore new interests? There's a lot of different reasons why people might want to get out in the community more. Okay, so trying to figure out the why, and that kind of gets back to that digging deeper. Trying to figure out the why is a really a big part of this as well. People with significant needs, we get a lot of questions about that because it's like, well, they can't always tell us what they want. Okay, true, but we also have the power of observation, right? And we talked earlier about that team process and trying to talk to the people that know that person the best. So whether it be family members who've known that person for a long time and historically know what that person might want, just observing, like, so finding different ways to use your power of observation, or talking to the people that know that person the best. And this gets back to, okay, are we working with providers? Are we working with the DSPs to ensure we know what that person's responding to and what they're not responding to? There also may be times where we don't have a clue what that person wants, or they may not have a clue what that person wants or what they want. And that's okay. It's okay. It's okay to say, we're not sure yet. And the outcome then becomes a process of exploration, becomes a process of discovery. We're trying to figure out what it is that they want. So, they may be trying to figure it out. And just the process of discovery is the actual outcome in itself. We also get questions, well, this person doesn't want to change. They don't want anything. They want things to stay the same. They want to do things that they've been doing for a long time. And it could respect that. Like, there's a lot of, especially in our field, we see a lot of people who receive services that like that consistency and they like that routine and they don't want to deviate from that. We also have to recognize that historically, people with disabilities have had limited opportunities, right? Like, kind of going back to that dignity of risk, like, historically, I think we've seen people that have been a little sheltered. They don't access the community the same way that people without disabilities do all the time. They may not know what's out there. And so part of that bridge to the community, it comes through those services that help them explore what might be of interest to them. And so I think that's a big part of it. I tell my kids all the time, like, there's times where they're like, oh, I don't want to do that, I don't want to do that, and then they do, and they're like, oh, that was great. Like, yeah, that's why we try new things sometimes, right? Try to do that with, like, vegetables, but that doesn't always work. And then we talked about, how people can change their mind, right? Outcomes can change, they can evolve. I always use the same example. So if I've spoken to you about this before, I apologize, but I always use the example of, like, cooking. Like, someone wants to cook, like, that's what's important to them. They're like, oh, I want to cook. They're watching all these Food Network shows. It's, like, so appealing to them, they want to go cook. And then, providers taking all these steps to these experiences, these services to help them learn how to cook or cook different things, and then, like, a month later they're like, nah, this is stupid, I don't want to do this. Like, cooking's a lot of work, and the food doesn't, my food doesn't taste as good as it looks on that show. So I'm not down with this anymore. Okay, change your mind, go back to the drawing board. It's okay. So I think one of the biggest things that I've noticed with the OhioISP is people are trying to be perfect right away. They're like, oh, I want this perfect plan. I want this to look, everything to be perfect. And the way that it's things are going to change. Things are going to evolve. And as we get to know that person better, we're going to find more and more things that better meet their needs and their wants. Next slide, please, Zach. Okay, and then this is just a slide about experiences. We talked about most of this already. So the experiences are in the past. I mean, we've called these different things, and I know it's probably like exhausting sometimes keeping up with some of the language that we use. But experiences are, may have called them action steps in the past. They're those things that are going to be the services. These are the things that you're going to document on to show that you're doing what is needed to help that person accomplish their outcomes. So I'll read along with you here. Using the individual's identified outcomes to direct the supports or action plans to achieve the outcome. Okay. Be creative. Talked about that. And don't be afraid to change those if they aren't effective. So all things that we've talked about. But remember, this is going back to that team process. This is a collaborative effort. Okay, not one person should be writing this plan on their own in a vacuum. SSAs shouldn't be responsible for generating this on their own. Providers shouldn't be writing this on their own without, like, we need collaboration from everyone and saying, like, here's what's worked, here's what hasn't worked, here's what the person wants. Let's look at the assessed need and the wants, and then let's work together to build something that's going to help this person live a meaningful life. Again, it all comes back to that. Okay. And then some resources on that next slide, Zach. Just some resources you guys could all reference. There's some guidance we have. That development cycle, I believe that's the one that I had showed. This OhioISP Made Easy guide is a really great reference. I think I might have a clip from that a little bit later on. And then the 6 essential elements self-review tool that I showed. And just a quick word about the presentation itself. I'll make sure that Nicole and Sabrina have the slides, and then you could share out as needed, or you could post it. I know the the recording will get posted, so whatever's easiest for you guys to get that information to everyone. Okay. I think this is the last outcome slide. So any questions on outcomes right now? We're going to get a little bit more into like the implementation piece in a bit, but just want to see if there's any questions on outcomes in general, what they are, how to develop them. That might be a first. All right. I guess we'll move on. I must have done that good of a job of explaining it. We'll go with that. All right. This is element 6, services and supports. Okay. So we talked about those 6 essential elements. This is the last element of those. If you're very curious, you can go to that document that we just showed you in the resources, and you can figure out what elements 1 through 4 are if you're curious. But really, all of these elements are ways to help get to good person-centered planning. So services and supports, these are clear descriptions that are going to address that person's needs. And I would even go as far as say needs and wants, because really services and support should address both. To achieve their outcomes, which I think most of the time though we see those services that help the person achieve their outcomes. Usually those align more with the experiences, so those kind of fall under that category. But they still are services and supports. And value the person's choices. We want to be respectful of what that person. So I guess maybe that's where the wants comes into play. valuing their choices and being respectful of what they want their life to look like. The plan is going to identify who is responsible for it and how often it occurs. So when you're looking at those services and supports, there's going to be a clear description of who the provider is and the frequency at which those services and supports are to occur. Admittedly, I don't love this statement. The description of each service should be detailed and specific. I mean, it should be detailed enough to describe what needs to be done, because I've seen some services that are listed that are maybe a little too detailed. I think there's a balance. Typically, you'll see, I think the general rule of thumb, I'm probably jumping the gun because I know we have like an FAQ on the next slide, but typically you'll see services that relate to risks, maybe, like things that kind of fall in line with what might be a risk, will be a little bit longer in nature because they're a little more descriptive just because they need to be. But we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit here. Lastly, based on what is learned by ongoing conversations. Again, everything that we've kind of talked about thus far. And this is paid supports. So there's paid supports, and then there's also additional supports. There's what we call natural supports that occur. So biggest thing is that when you have identified needs and wants from that assessment, they should be addressed in some sort of way in that plan. Okay, so how are we getting those needs and wants met? Well, here's the plan. Here's how we address them. This should cover it, right? Next slide, Zach. There we are. There's the FAQs. Okay, so these are questions we get a lot, and I'm going to do my best to answer them in the best possible way. I also know that there are times where things change, and if I don't know the answer, I'll always say I don't know the answer, and we'll get back to you, okay? So how about we do this? How about I call on someone to read the question, and then I'll do my best to answer it. Or maybe I'll ask you guys the questions. I don't know. I hadn't really thought this through. Thank you, Sabrina. We might need to edit this part out from the recording. Great question, Sabrina. I don't know how you came up with that one. All right. So we talked about it a little bit on the previous slide, but so there's the services and support section, and then there's the outcome section. The outcome section does have services and supports, essentially, that are listed there as experiences, because experiences are services and supports. Okay, but there are services and supports that align with that outcome. So if you have an outcome for that person wanting to, let's go back to the person wants to get their own apartment someday. Then what goes into that process? What is going to help that person get into their own apartment? Maybe there is some concern about them keeping their apartment clean if they were to live on their own. Maybe there's some sort of need area for staff to help that person with cleaning their room or their house. So if we have a situation like that where cleaning or keeping a tidy environment is going to help that person get to where they want to have their own apartment, then that might align with that outcome. Maybe hygiene. I don't know. Maybe hygiene relates to that person having their own place someday, just because I don't know, like it would be beneficial, like if they were in their own place and they don't have staffing 24 hours a day, like Obviously, you need to keep up with your hygiene, so maybe that's part of it. Maybe there are behavioral concerns, and so maybe that aligns with that particular outcome. There's a lot of different things. It's really whatever aligns with that outcome. If that's going to help that person get to that goal, then those things could fall in as experiences under that outcome section. All other needs and wants can be addressed in that services and support section. So that's sort of like your catch-all. Like anything else that's being done, anything else that staff or providers are doing would then fall in that services and support section. As far as like the question about differences between county boards and ICFs, and I know I really included the ICFs part here just because I didn't know, like sometimes we have agencies that do both waiver and ICF services. So if that is the case, some of our ICF folks obviously have the requirement to include programs. That's a ODH requirement that they include programs or goals. And a lot of those are like skill development goals. So we get asked a lot, well, where do we put those in the plan? And you guys may even see, SSAs as when someone transfers from an ICF to the county board. You might see those as part of the plan when you get them. Those programs have to live somewhere. So sometimes those will live in the outcome section under the experiences, and sometimes those will live in services and supports. Really kind of the same process goes into it, just making sure they get that in the plan itself. Okay. Yeah, scope of service. I didn't realize that was the next question. I thought you were still going off that one. Yeah, you're keeping me on task, so I'm all right. What do you include in scope of service? That's a great question. So we do get, and we get a lot of these other questions that are part of it too. Scope of service is really what is the provider to do? How are they going to provide that support? So we call it scope of service. It's really what are we doing? What is going to help that person? So, how much detail must be included? Talked about it a little bit earlier. The detail, it's going to vary depending on the person. For some people, things could be said in a very concise way. For others, it might be a little more involved. Okay, so don't have a great answer for that one. It's just going to depend. I will say, and we'll get into this a little bit more here, but if you are carrying over information from the risk section, usually in that scope of service, you're going to see a lot more detail because naturally risks by nature are going to present a risk, and so the support has to be clearly spelled out. So if a person's at a choking risk, person's at a fall risk, person is at risk of hurting someone else or themselves, then again, the supports are going to look a little bit more detailed just because of the nature of the risk. I would say this should be as concise as is needed with the understanding that the provider needs to know what needs to be done. Okay, so I know it's a lot of words there, not very concise on my end, but the provider, the DSP needs to know what they need to do. Okay, what support needs to be provided. So as much detail as is needed for that to occur. I would say, there are times where, I don't want to say canned, because that kind of takes the person-centeredness out of it. There are times where it could look similar, but I would always base it on what is needed for that person. So when you're talking about ADS services, yeah, I think in general, a lot of those services are focusing on socialization, community integration, communication skills. You're looking to build a lot of those same types of skills. So some of them may look pretty similar, but again, like how you accomplish those could be different depending on the person. So yeah, I kind of know where you're going with that, and I think it's kind of how I would address that. We get this question a lot. Nicole, do you want to read that one? Nice and loud.
Let me turn my microphone
Yeah,
on.
there you go.
Should we carry over supports from? Oh, we're still on this one.
Yeah,
Sorry.
this one.
Are there services that can be combined? Should they be separated?
Great question. All right. So, services getting combined. This is a little bit of a tricky one because we'll get asked like, well, do we have to separate all of these different like hygiene supports? So, bathing, helping the person with toothbrushing, helping the person with shaving, putting on deodorant. All of these different skills, because then we could end up with 100 different supports, right? So the best way that I can answer this question is yes, you can combine services when it makes sense. So if there are hygiene tasks that need to occur at the same frequency, especially like, and that's really important part of it is, at the same frequency, we can kind of talk about those as a general like hygiene tasks are going to occur daily, right? But if there are specific things that are part of that, so say maybe that person's at risk for like tooth decay. They have bad, they go to the dentist a lot, and there's a risk of tooth decay. Well, then maybe that needs to be pulled out separately because as a provider, well, first of all, as an SSA, you're going to want to make sure this is being done, right? This support is occurring. And so we're very clear on what needs to be done to prevent this. And as a provider, you want to protect yourself, right? Like, you want to document that you guys are doing those things because if there's an MUI, you can say, yeah, like we're brushing his teeth. Like you can look at our documentation, brushing his teeth daily, multiple times a day. They're maybe visiting the dentist every 6 months. So all of these different things. So I'd say like when it makes sense to combine those, sure, you can combine those. But also noting that there may be times where certain things might need to be pulled out and addressed separately. Any questions on that one? All right. I feel like the whole people asking questions, I feel like you guys are probably going to like, all right, this is getting old. What is the expectation for ADS and vocab services? So adult day supports and vocab. Obviously, there are times where I've seen these, like the service or support is just listed as the person will attend adult day and receive adult day supports, or they will receive vocab services. And it's just very vague and general and doesn't say anything about what the provider's supposed to do. So the expectation is very similar to what, with any other service. We need to be very clear on what is expected of that provider. And so we talked about it a little bit earlier, some of those adult day support services, maybe there's a focus on socialization or getting out in community. So whatever that might be would be spelled out for that particular provider. And the same thing holds true for vocab services. Vocab, we're obviously working toward a goal of community employment. And so you have the services that are gearing that person up for employment. And here's how we're going to do this. This is what we're working on. So just like with any HPC or shared living or any other residential services, that's the same expectation for adult day. we need to be very clear about what's to be expected. And again, teams should be working together to ensure that what is listed in the plan is what is happening, and vice versa. Okay. Should we carry over supports from the risk section? Okay. So admittedly, we've been having a lot of discussion about this. I know our OhioISP team and our compliance unit have been working together. We did a webinar on services and supports back in June, and stemming from that, we had some questions that had come in from that webinar, asking different questions, and for the most part, we're all kind of on the same page. This one we kind of paused a little bit because there was enough of a discrepancy in some of the things we were saying that we were like, we need to have some further discussion. But I will say this: so historically, this has always been my response, and I will say this, and then I'll cage it by saying, if something changes or if there's something else that I hear, I will be sure to pass that information along. But how we've kind of always approached this in general has been, it's taken a little bit more of a shape just because of how the OhioISP is set up. So in the OhioISP, there's the risk section, and there's the identifying of the risk, and there is a column that says, here are what are the supports to address this risk, in as many words. And when we talk about carrying over supports, the question that we get is specifically carrying over from that risk section where we do have a column that identifies what the supports are right there. Should we carry that over to the services and support section? Okay, so hopefully we're getting a sense as to how that's framed. And I'll show you the template of the OhioISP later so we can maybe see it visually. But are we taking that information from the risk section and what we're doing to support that risk and putting it into services and supports? And what I've always told people is it's not required. It's not required, but it's recommended. Okay, so if I'm an SSA or I'm a county board, the way I'm looking at that is it's probably going to be best addressed by carrying that over to service and supports, because as a provider, a lot of times your documentation, and I've seen a lot of provider documentation over the years, providers usually pull from that service and support section for their documentation sheets, right? And so my concern as an SSA or as a county board, supervisor, director, would be that something would get missed if I didn't carry it over. Now, with that being said, as a provider, you are required to implement the ISP as written, right? Like that's what we're doing the training on. So you're implementing that plan. And so if there are parts of that risk section where you see those supports, technically you should be providing those supports. I think where it gets a little gray is like, well, that may not flow into your documentation the way it traditionally has. And so I think that's where a little bit of the concern comes into play, because we certainly want to be ensuring that those supports for risks are being implemented, and then again, like as a provider, ensuring that you're protected in a lot of ways through your documentation, if there were to be like an MUI or some other incident. So that's just kind of how I've always looked at that, and a lot of my colleagues and people in compliance have kind of agreed with that stance. But I think this is just kind of more, there's going to be more discussion on this moving forward.
Hey, Jim.
Hey, Nicole.
Just as an FYI, Brian Summers, who's one of our SSA managers, just shared that Medina is including additional support details in the known and likely risk section. The support and service section will reference the known and likely risk section for additional details.
Okay. All right, so they're just pointing back to the known and likely risk section then? Okay. Okay. Yeah, I always worry a little bit with like see this section kind of stuff, but I think that should work. I might need to like see that in action just to like wrap my brain around it, but calling that out, it makes sense from that standpoint. Okay. How do we properly address frequency? So as I said, the services supports, there's going to be that scope, but then there's also frequency that's addressed. And the frequency is really sort of the expectation as far as like how often something will occur. This isn't always known. Like there's some services that like you know how often they're going to occur. Like hygiene is going to be on a daily basis if that person needs help with their hygiene. But like getting out into the community. So say like, you know, the person wants to go, you know, go out to some venue on a monthly basis. Well, it may not always be exactly a monthly basis. I think the biggest thing here is establishing sort of that minimum standard. And what I mean by that is, like, we have to give the provider some sense as to how often this should be occurring to meet their wants and needs. And if we do that, we set that minimum frequency. So say like something we're not exactly sure how often it's going to occur, but we say monthly because that's sort of like a safe estimate. And then the provider's doing it 2 to 3 times monthly, then that's great. Like, okay, like, that's okay. It's okay to do it more frequently than is required. What they're going to run into issues with from a provider standpoint is if they do it less frequently. So then those compliance reviewers, are going to come out and they're going to say, well, this isn't meeting that established frequency. And so that's really what we have to work as a team to ensure that we're kind of meeting the mark on that. Sometimes, again, it's hard to assess, like behavioral interventions. Do we know how often someone's going to have physical aggression all the time? No. Like, or do we know how often we're going to have to redirect someone from some sort of behavioral concern? Not always. So then that's where we get into some tricky territory. It's like, oh, as needed. We get a lot of like, well, how do you feel about as needed? Okay, well, as needed doesn't always establish that minimum frequency, because if you're a compliance reviewer, you're going out and something says as needed, it's not needed. It's not for us to judge. So as needed doesn't really set that minimum frequency. But there are going to be times where, like I said, with behavioral things, you may need to just be very vague. And so in situations like that, there's really not a great way. I've heard people say, well, like, we put per incident. Like, I feel like that might be a little bit better, a little more information. So if there's an incident that occurred, a behavioral incident, then we're going to be providing this service. The biggest thing here, I'd say, is just sort of, and that's going to be more of the outlier. The biggest thing is, like, you don't want to set people up for failure. So if we have situations where we want to provide a little leeway. I know I've talked to a lot of providers who've said, like, well, like, we'd like this range. So, like, can you say, like, 1 to 5 times per week? Yeah. that seems reasonable. Or at least once a week, or at least weekly, right? Like that sets that minimum tone. What you don't want to do is like that up to 5 times weekly. It's then like zeros up to 5 times, right? So it's just sort of in the framing of it. And I think we could find ways to ensure that we could establish that minimum frequency, ensure that people are getting the services at the rate they need to, while also making sure that people aren't getting in trouble for it. Like we're not setting people up for failure as a result. Does that help? Does that make sense? Do we have any questions? Cool. Nope. Any other questions on the questions? Okay. All right. This slide is that. Oh, there it is. I know it's a little smaller, but again, we'll make sure you guys get copies of the presentation. This is also from that. I actually just compiled this slide based on that OhioISP Made Easy document. It's really just a summary of what each of these represents. So I think it does a really good job of kind of clarifying what goes where, because we get a lot of that, like with the OhioISP, like what lives where. And so risks, that's where you're putting your immediate health and safety, risk of harm to self or others, potential legal sanction. Outcomes, okay, so this is what the person wants to accomplish and why, and then kind of talks about what outcomes are, and then the experiences, how those help to lead that person to achieving their outcomes. Services and supports, because sometimes it becomes a little bit tricky as to like what goes where. But this document I feel like does a really good job of kind of clarifying that. So again, you'll get the slides, but this is also part of our OhioISP Made Easy guide that is available on our website. You have to edit that one out too. Cool. 5 times fast. Okay. And again, these all are part of that ISP section along with the restrictive measures. So this is what you're going to see in the ISP. This is what providers are going to be training their staff on. All right, but it's all just a summary of what we discussed today. So next slide, please. I'll just try to pull this slide in wherever I can. It's a really good reminder about person-centered planning versus system-centered planning. Again, we want our focus to be over here. We want this to be more of what we do as opposed to this. We want the people to drive what their plans look like as opposed to programs. Systems are good in a lot of ways, but we also don't want that to drive the planning. We want the person to choose their team. We don't want the professionals to drive that process. Again, the team's going to work on the person's agenda. Notice it doesn't just say SSA. It doesn't just say provider. It's the team are going to work on that. That includes guardians and everyone outside of this. So we didn't talk about everyone on the team because we're talking to SSAs and providers here today. But everyone on that team is part of that process, and we want everyone's voice to be heard. Okay? Changes in supports and services based on the person's wants and needs as opposed to organizational decisions or needs. Supports designed for and around the person. We don't want this to occur just once a year or just to be assigned to a program. Talk about this a lot with community integration too. So when providers are giving people options for community activities, so this could be residential or it could be adult day, people are going out in the community, we sometimes will see like those calendars or the schedules, and well, this person can go out in the community. They're choosing where they go from this list or from this calendar. All right, well, it's great, but how are we developing this list, or how are we developing this calendar? Is this just where we want to go, or what's convenient for us to go to, or are the people actively involved in this process? Are they involved in selecting some of those places where they could go? Is their input being heard? So we want to make sure that it aligns with what their wants are, as opposed to just like, well, we're just going to go here because today's bowling day, and then next week's going to be a movie, and then next week is going to be this. If the people who are participating, if they don't want to do any of those things, if that doesn't align with what they want, then they're going to refuse, right? So we got to make sure it makes sense for the person and the people that might be attending that as a whole. Plans about the person's life as opposed to about the document. So just keeping that in mind. All right, last section, and this will be the quickest one, so we're almost there, folks. Again, we talk about planning a lot, but we don't always talk about the implementation side. So really, this is about putting the plan into action. Hence I was proud of that. I was like trying, going through the stock images, and I'm looking up implementation. Nothing coming up. Thanks for humoring me. It's just the little things. Yeah. I like it. Yeah, this is being recorded. Sorry, there's dad jokes. All right. Receiving the plan. So obviously the OhioISP receiving the plan is going to be the first step of implementation, right? Like, you're going to have to receive the plan before you can start implementing it. And so we've had a lot of questions from providers specifically. Well, what is our access to the OhioISP system? Where are we at with that? And truly, we do have providers that can access our OhioISP online system right now. We are not in position to like onboard everyone as a whole, and to be doing that in these big droves, because we know there's a lot of providers out there, and so we're still working with the online system to ensure that we're getting plans in, because we know that there was a June 30th, 2024 deadline to get plans in, but we also know that there's still people that are getting those plans in. It's not all plans are in yet. We still got some that aren't in, and we're working hard to get those in, and we're working with the SSAs and the Qs to ensure that those get in. Now, January 1st of 2025 is when I think the real deadline comes into play, which is when people are going to start getting citations if plans aren't in the system. So from a provider standpoint, that's probably when you guys will start to see all of those plans in the system. So I don't know, Sabrina, where you guys stand with getting your plans in, but I know our area in general in Northeast Ohio, most of the counties have done a really good job of getting those plans in, even the ones that have onboarded a little bit later. But we still have some work to do. So all that to say, like, providers, we can get you in, and if you want to, you can reach out to me, and we can try to get you that access. I know you guys working with PSI or Britco? Britco, okay. Some of the vendors have provided, so Britco is a vendor that counties or ICFs will use. They'll enter the plan there, and it'll transmit to our system. All the plans have to transmit and live in our system, so that team members can access our system and access all the plans. Okay, so they all have to be in there. Britco is one of the vendors that I think they do allow providers, I'm not sure within your county, but providers can access through Britco. But the goal is for providers to be able to access through our DODD system, so that if you're working in multiple counties, you might be in Britco in one county, you might be working in a different county that uses another vendor. It's just an easier point of access where you can access all of them through our system. So we are getting to the point where we can get providers in, and I guess all that to say, like, more to come for providers and access to our system. But if you want it now, you can certainly reach out to me, and we'll do our best to try to get you in there. Talked about the OhioISP being a single plan with 3 parts. So there's that introduction, that discovery assessment, and the ISP. So just kind of a reminder of that. Providers, reminder, training staff on the ISP. Okay, so when you get this, this document that might be, 30, 40, 50 pages in some cases, depends. You only have to train on that ISP portion. We don't have to go through all of those assessment questions that provide, a lot of detail. Really, all of the important pieces of that assessment should be carried through into the ISP itself, and so that's what you need to train on. Obviously, if you want to make the full document available to staff, might be a good idea just so that they can reference it, but the ISP is going to have all of that important information for them. Your goal as providers is to ensure that those services and supports and experiences are provided at the identified frequency. So you're going to ensure that staff are providing those services and then documenting on them. So what are we documenting on? Services and supports. We're documenting on outcomes and experiences. And then we talked about risks earlier. So, there's the supports that are listed there as part of that risk section. So it sounds like based on how everything's set up here, at least in Medina, we're going to want to ensure that those supports as part of that risk section are being documented as well. And then obviously we're sharing any input that we have with the team. So that ongoing communication and feedback that we've talked about throughout, whether it be changes that you guys have seen that need to occur. It might be something that's in there in the plan that either isn't happening anymore or you're not doing. Share that with the SSA, with the team. Any refusals, like I talked about, like there's a reason why people refuse to do something. So if they're refusing to do something, maybe we need to go back and figure out something different to do. Yeah. And figuring out what those barriers are. Like, why are we not making progress to this outcome? What can we do differently? So I think that's all part of it. We're documenting, and we're understanding this is a fluid, living document that is going to change, and so we have to adjust as we go forward. Next slide, Zach. And this is just a copy of from our paper version. I probably and I think moving forward, one of the things that I'd love to do is just maybe get an example, just a redacted example, and put it up here. But this is the known and likely risk section, and this is what we were talking about. So for each assessment section, you can identify areas of risk. And not all of these need to be filled out or may be filled out. For some folks, it might be totally blank. For others, there might be something in each section. For some, it might just be 1 or 2. So it just depends on the person. But this is the risk, and then this is the support and why the person needs the support. So for the risk, here's what we're doing to support that person. So the SSA or Q is going to fill this part out based on that risk, and then we're going to identify supervision if that's needed, and then who's responsible. So this is a kind of glimpse of that risk section that you might have seen before. And this is why we're talking about, well, does this, since it's a support, does this need to go into that services and support section? And I think just based on our discussion today, it sounds like you guys are going to reference back to this risk section so that providers know that this is what they need to do for the risks. Okay. Next slide, Zach. This is the outcome and experience section. So we have some different questions. Primarily, what is the outcome? What does the person want to accomplish, and why? We talk about progress. We talk about some details that might need to be known in the review. But here are the experiences. So this is really what needs to happen, how it happens, who's responsible, and then here's our frequency. So again, providers, we're making sure that we're documenting on what needs to happen and how often that needs to occur. Okay? Making sure we're meeting that frequency. So that's outcomes and experiences. Next slide, Zach. Services and supports, this is how this section looks. Again, wish I had a looking back, probably should have just done a redacted example, but assessment area, funding source, service name, scope of the service, that's really going to be the bulk of what is happening here. So what that support looks like, this is where you're going to see what's being documented on, and then how often, how much, that's our frequency. And then usually the beginning and end date is just going to run with the span. But this section it's teased out based on the provider. So as a provider, you're going to see your name at the top, agency or independent provider, whomever, and then you're going to see all the services that you're responsible for. And then based on each provider, you're going to see that list of what needs to happen for each. Okay. Next slide, please. And just as a little bit of a recap, so obviously when we get to the end of the planning process, person-centered plan, what do we want to accomplish? We want to help that person achieve those outcomes in the most integrated community setting. So the goal is to help that person achieve that outcome, and then once we get that person to achieving their outcome, then we reset. Okay, well, what do we do next? What do we want to do next? That's the goal here, is to help that person keep moving forward, keep achieving their outcomes, and living their best life. It's also going to ensure that the delivery of services is in a manner that reflects their personal preferences and choices. Obviously, that's something that we want to do. We want it to represent the person and not just the program. We want it to be person-centered, not program-specific. And then lastly, contribute to the assurance of health and welfare. So, we talked a lot about dignity of risk and allowing a person to make choices, but we also do ultimately have to maintain health and safety. So we need that to occur as well. So kind of balancing all of this, but that's really what we're going to end up with when we finish this process. Okay. And the last slide, Zach. Okay. Just some open Q&A now. We've got about 13 minutes-ish. But here's some information for me. Email, phone number, and then I mentioned our OhioISP website. So if you want to check out some of the resources we have, there's lots of good stuff there for SSAs, providers. We've got some FAQs. Some sample plans. So if you guys are interested in looking at, what a finished plan might look like, if you haven't seen it already, go check out our website. It's good to reference. And then if you have any questions about the OhioISP in general, I try to be very accessible, and I'm sort of the regional contact, but you can always reach out to our OhioISP email too. But we'll open it up for questions. Anyone online or?
Yep. Make sure that's on. Okay, let's see. Regarding documentation on the Ohio ISP system, since ISPs are evolving throughout the year, what is the best way to make changes to the Ohio ISP throughout the year? For example, in the discovery assessment section, if there are changes to health status, do we update the healthy living section and denote an area with revised date, or should we attach documents to the Ohio ISP?
So we're asking about like revisions to the plan then, essentially? Okay. I'll try to answer, and if I miss the mark on the answer, then someone could certainly correct me. But yeah, if you're revising a plan, the process for revising is just going into the system. So I'm assuming that's coming from an SSA? No? Okay. Well, then I assumed wrong. What I get for assuming. So yeah, if a revision's occurring, the SSA is going to go in, they're going to make the change in the system itself. Okay. The system then creates a new plan, and the new plan will then get dispersed. It could be through the online system, which some providers will be accessing through the online system. Or if a provider wants to continue to get the plan through email or mail or whatever, however that preference is, we still want to be respectful of the fact that not everyone's going to access it through the online system. Okay? This holds true for providers or other team members as well. So guardians would be included in that. So if they want it to be mailed out, you're going to get an updated copy of that. Now, with our system, with our DODD system, it will show the reason for the change or the reason for the update, and you'll see that reflected. For vendor systems, we've shared a document. It's like a revision document, and I don't know, maybe Sabrina, maybe you could speak to this a little bit better, but there's a revision document that we've shared out with the field where you can fill it out and you can say, well, this is the revision that's occurring, just so it's very clear, because I know for providers it's hard to go through and like you see a full new plan come through. It's like, well, what change is made? Like I don't know where to find it, and you don't have the time to look through, you know, all of these pages and try to identify and compare from one to the other. So Sabrina, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I don't know if you have a thought about revisions and how those would look, or John.
Attachment that goes with the plan.
Okay.
To, explain why that revision occurred, who was a part of that planning process.
Okay.
And it's the front page of that plan that comes to the provider.
Okay. So, yeah, I think a lot of times that's, yeah, it's.
Hello. So, yeah, we don't always get that first page, so then I'll send an email back to the SSA asking what the revision's for. So it'll show the actual content of the plan, but not the revision page. So I've addressed that, and then they're good about getting this, hey, this is why it's on there, but it doesn't always show up when they're sending the request for the signature. I believe so, yeah, but not when they're sending out the request for the signature. So then you're like, why am I signing this? So.
Yeah, and some of it, I mean, technology's great, but like we have seen situations where like it's just a timing thing, like where something shows up, but it's not until it's finalized, and it would be good to have that before you're signing it, right? So like, I think as we move forward, hopefully that becomes a little bit more consistent, and if there's any way, like, I know you guys are using Brick as a vendor, but like working with the vendors, we can try to find ways to help enhance that process and make it work for everyone. Yeah, there's a way for some of those documents to be uploaded into the systems as well. So if you have either some sort of team meeting or even things like self-administration assessments, like sometimes those can be uploaded in the system as well, and they'll show in the vendor system and in our system. Any other questions? Did that answer it?
Yeah, just let us know online if that answered your question or if we need further clarification. And then anybody else online, please feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A.
While we're waiting, anyone here? Questions, thoughts?
All right, I'm not seeing anything else online. But I'll check right before we wrap up. So just, again, thank you, Jim, for your time today to present on this topic. Thank you all for being here. We will get you a copy of the slides that will come out in a follow-up email along with the recording in case you need to reference back to anything that we talked about today. Just a couple things coming up in September. We're offering a CPI verbal intervention training that's on September 10th. Any providers as well as MCBDD staff are welcome to attend. That's a full-day training. Again, that's just the verbal intervention piece. Our provider and SSA Mingle is going to be at the Lodge at Camp Paradise. The Society is hosting, so thank you to them. That's Wednesday, September 25th. And then also there's flyers in the back, but we have our Interactive Tech Expo coming up on September 26th at Summit Mall. That is a collaboration between our county board, Summit DD, and We Thrive Together. So that should be pretty cool. So everybody's invited. Please come and check that out. Other than that, let me just check and make sure there's nothing else we have online. She said, yes, thank you. That answered her question. And then Brian did say, Josh, that's a topic we can address with our SSAs. This issue is that the meeting minutes that contain this info as a supplemental document. When the Britco signature request is sent, it only sends the OhioISP as defined in the system, which does not include the additional documents. Hopefully you know what that means.
Like I said, I think it's a timing thing, and so, you know, as we continue to work through this, I think sometimes technology like gets in the way a little bit. Like, you know, we've seen that throughout the course of our implementation with the OhioISP. So, you know, we know it could provide a lot of good, and we want to make your jobs a lot easier, a lot more efficient. I think that's going to continue to happen over time. But you know, things like that, they're helpful to know so that we can help kind of get to where we need to be with the system. Thank you. Thank you, guys.